simple information on COVID-19 vaccine. Okay. Today we have three distinguished speakers. We have Dr. Lim Teck On, who will be speaking on scientific aspect of COVID-19. Okay, and then we have Dr. Benedict Sim, who will be touching on the clinical aspect. And of course, we also have Jay Padasyan, who will be speaking on the global aspect of COVID-19 vaccine. Okay, so before we go on, if you all have is a webinar, there will be one CPD point will be given. So probably towards the middle, the QR code is will be displayed. You can use your MMA app to scan. Okay, and then what do you call it? You can raise your hand or you can put your questions in the Q&A, and later you will ask the questions to the panelists. And later this event will be moderated by Dr. Murali. He's just in another webinar joining us shortly. And then the last, I will be just giving a very brief update on the current vaccination program by the government. So I hope the sound is very clear. If you have any problem with the sound, please do put in the chat box. Visual, anything, please put that. Take note, we do have two IT officers over here. Okay, so without much further ado, we would like to introduce the first speaker. Okay. Dr. Lim Teck On, you ready? Yeah.
Hi, yeah.
Okay. So basically, okay, Dr. Lim Teck On. So basically, when we say about Dr. Lim Teck On, he's currently a consultant in clinical research and medical statistician. He's a graduate from University of Glasgow, and they got a master's in medical statistics. I think not many of them got masters in medical statistics, an expert in that. And then he was the director of CRC, and under his tenure, I think they opened up a network of 17 branches nationwide. He has numerous publications, and recently also he has written in Code Blue. And then he's very critical, and then most importantly, he's also very, very practical. And today, I'd like to have it's a great honor and privilege to have Dr. Lim Teck On to actually educate us on the scientific aspect of COVID-19, as we know that a lot of aspects in terms of clinical trials, safety, vaccine efficacies. So let us hear from Dr. Lim. Please, Dr. Lim.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Can you hear me loud and clear? Well, I suppose I'm not getting a response, but that's quite all right. Dr. Arasu, I can share my screen now, is it?
Yes, Dr. Lim, you can share.
Okay. Can you guys see the screen? Let me get the Let me get the full screen going up. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my medical colleagues and everybody. It's a huge privilege to be invited to give a talk on what doctors need to know about COVID-19 vaccine. And my brief is basically to summarize some of the recent scientific advances pertaining to the COVID-19 vaccine. I'll keep it brief and I'll keep it simple. It's a complex subject, obviously. And so let me just take you very quickly. Next. Dr. Arasu, can everyone see the screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You can see, Dr. Lim. Probably you can do under the, you can expand it.
It's already on full screen for me. So, all right. So I'll take you through three subjects very quickly. Number one is, of course, we need to set the context. We're talking about vaccination in Malaysia and why we need the vaccine badly in this country. Just a couple of slides on that. Then, of course, I plunge into the science, the science behind the vaccine, what's called the vaccinology, the various platform for developing vaccines against COVID-19. And finally, obviously, I need to tell you something about the products. We have a lot of products now coming into the market, the frontliners, the backrunners, as well as, of course, quickly summarize the result of some of the trials that provide the basis for the registration of these vaccines that many of us are going to get soon. And of course, I think a very important issue that many of us, I'm sure, is very concerned about, emerging variants and whether these vaccines that we are all just going to have will they be efficacious against these emerging variants? So I'll just cover these three subjects then. So very quickly, a quick rundown on what countries need to do to get COVID under control. And of course, basically, it's broken down into either you go for a suppression strategy, and in fact, some countries in Asia Pacific countries were very successful in this regards. Well, our neighbor Singapore is very successful, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, not to mention Vietnam even, have been very successful in suppressing vaccine. And of course, these countries are in no hurry now to introduce vaccine, and well, we don't see much COVID in their countries. Unfortunately, we are not in that camp, so we are now back to basically mitigations. The next best thing we could do is try to mitigate COVID-19. Yes?
Dr. Sorry, I think you're not moving the slides.
I'm not moving the slide. Yeah. Am I still on this slide now?
You're on the first slide.
I'm still on the first slide now. So now, that's funny. Am I moving? You see any movement? No.
Okay.
Am I on the right track now?
Still on the first slide.
Let me see. What can I? So on my screen, I'm on the second slide. So let me see.
Can you put in a slideshow, Dr. Lim?
Yeah, it's on slideshow.
On your side, huh?
Okay. On my slide. Okay, I'm back to the contents. You can see the contents. Yes.
Dr. Lim, is it okay that you will share it from here?
Okay, please do that. Yes. I've sent you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah.
Okay, for your colleagues, just hang on for a while, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I'm not an expert on this.
Dr. Lim, you got to stop sharing.
Okay. I have to stop sharing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm done, right? Good.
Okay, Dr. Lim, you can go ahead.
Okay, let me resume or let me restart then, huh? Okay, you will then change the slide for me, huh? Thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. Let's quickly restart again. The contents of my presentation this evening will be, number one, I'm going to set the context, basically explaining why we need vaccines so badly now in Malaysia. Of course, then I'll go on to the vaccinology, which is the main part of my talk. I was told to tell you to present something on the science behind the vaccine. So the various vaccine various platforms on developing vaccines against COVID-19. Lastly, obviously, I have to tell you something about the products, all these vaccines that are now coming into the market. Many of us will be receiving our vaccines soon. I'm looking forward to mine too. I'll summarize some of the recent trial results, obviously. And there are many vaccine trials now coming to Malaysia. So I'd like to tell you about some of these clinical trials. And finally, I think a very important subject that's at the heart that many of us are very concerned about, the emerging variants and whether these COVID-19 vaccines that we have now, will they still work? Will they still be efficacious against these emerging variants? Next, please. Okay, so let's plunge into it. Any countries need to implement pandemic control measures, right? You basically have two choices in terms of strategies. Either you go for suppressions, and some countries in Asia Pacific countries have been very successful, including our neighbor in Singapore, Taiwan, even Vietnam. So they were able to suppress COVID so much that now they're in no hurry really to rush into a vaccine. They could wait. Unfortunately for us in Malaysia, we are not in that camp. We don't have that luxury. So we are basically in mitigation. We just have to do the next best thing to try to mitigate the effect of COVID on our country. There are basically 5 control measures, 3 old-fashioned one, and we have just, of course, went through an MCO. Of course, you need to do test and trace. You need to practice social distancing. But the 2 measures that is very technology dependent, obviously, is one, vaccination, and the second one actually is mass screening. But I won't be talking to you about that tonight. So I'm focusing largely on vaccination strategy. Next, please. So here we are. Unfortunately, we didn't make it, right? We tried. I think I'm sure the KKM and the government tried very hard last year, but we didn't really make it. So we went through a very nasty second wave. We are glad that the counts are now just beginning to drop, but nevertheless, we didn't get it under control, and therefore, the only thing left really for us to do next, please. Well, we pay a very heavy price. Our economy contracted almost 5% or so last year, and well, many people suffer out there because of this. But there's just so much water under the bridge now. So what can we do? Next, please. Let's give up. We have to go for mass vaccination now. We just have to get as many Malaysians vaccinated as soon as we can. And second thing we can do actually is mass screening. For example, my daughter is just returning to school, and I like to see some more screening being conducted in school, or for that matter in factories and workplaces, where most of these COVID-19 classes are occurring. But that's another story. Tonight, we just concentrate on vaccination. Next, please. So here you are, the science behind the vaccine, the subject called vaccinology. Now, just to remind everyone very quickly and very simply, a vaccine simply exposes our body to an antigen. An antigen may be a protein or otherwise a polysaccharide, derived, of course, from the pathogen. And then that antigen is supposed to provoke an immune response in us, right? Yet without causing a disease in us. So giving us an antigen that provoke an immune response without causing the COVID-19 disease. That's basically what we're trying to do in vaccination. All candidates vaccine to date that we have in the market, they all employ viral antigen or gene sequences to induce a neutralizing antibodies against the viral spike protein. So all manufacturers, all developers of vaccine that we have today primarily basically target S, spike protein, right? And I'm not saying, well, you can see on that picture there, the schematic of the structure of the structure of the virus. And you have, of course, the spike protein, the most important part that everyone is going after as far as vaccine design is concerned. And you have the membrane protein, the nucleocapsid, envelope protein, and nucleocapsid, and so on and so forth. Those, no one is saying that they're not important, but from the point of view of designing a vaccine, more or less everyone's, well, at least nearly a year ago, everybody guessed that spike protein should be the one to go after. And we could induce neutralizing antibodies, our body to produce neutralizing antibodies against spike protein, then we stand a chance of, well, stopping the virus from infecting us. And of course, it turns out that obviously the spike protein play an important role in viral entry, right? We know that the spike protein, or at least RBD, the receptor domain part of the spike protein, is the one responsible for engaging our cells, the ACE2 receptors on our cells, and through that mechanism, enter our cells and thereby infect us. So that was a guess, and the guess turned out to be correct. Now at the bottom of the picture there, you can see the genome, right? So that's the genome of the COVID-19 virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and you can see S there. So S, that will be the sequence of the S, the DNA sequence of the spike protein as represented on the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And that will be important, obviously, in some of those vaccines. Next, please. So you got an idea. Basically, you want to introduce an antigen. An antigen will be, of course, a protein. We don't use polysaccharide antigen for viral vaccine. That's largely only used in bacterial vaccine. So there are basically, if you like, 7 vaccine platforms. The platform is just simply a general methodology for generating vaccine against variety of immunogens from variety of pathogens. And as you can see, the 5 highlighted ones are the one that currently that we have COVID-19 vaccine. The first one, attenuated whole virus, that's in fact the oldest known one. That's in fact the oldest known vaccine that we have, but it's not actually used in COVID-19. I think for pretty obvious reason. Nobody really wants to attenuate the COVID-19 virus. and then thinking that it is potentially safe to inject into human. So the safer thing to do really is just completely inactivate the virus. Well, it's dead virus, and dead virus don't infect you. So that's the second one. The third one, of course, is to use a protein subunit. So instead of taking a whole virus, you take a particular protein part of the virus. In this case, the spike protein part of the virus, and then use that as the antigen, or use that as a vaccine. Another platform, of course, is the so-called virus-like particle. So instead of using one particular protein subunit, you try to assemble various parts of the virus without including the RNA sequences. So obviously, that virus cannot replicate. It therefore cannot infect you. But it nevertheless still contain all the structural proteins, and we hope that these will be immunogenic. The next way to generate vaccine, obviously, is instead of using the virus itself or otherwise use part of the virus, the protein part of the virus, well, you could use a viral vector. A viral vector is just a virus that's able to transfer DNA into our genome. So if you inject a viral vector into human, the vector then transfer a copy of DNA. In this case, the DNA sequence, the DNA sequence of the spike protein into our genome. And therefore, we can now start producing protein, the spike protein, in fact, according to that sequence, according to the DNA sequence that is now inserted into our cells. So that's the basis of producing a vaccine through using viral vectors. And the one we have currently all are based on adenovirus, ADV, the common virus, the virus that causes a common cold. Then the next one is the so-called famous Pfizer's mRNA vaccine. So that instead of using a vector to transfer DNA into our genome, what we could simply do is transfer mRNA. As you know, messenger RNA has a function of translating into protein. So if you could get the mRNA into the cytosol of the cell, into the cytoplasm of the cell, the mRNA now could start producing protein using the cell machinery. And of course, that mRNA sequence that we have in the vaccine is that of a spike protein. And therefore, we now produce a copy of the spike protein. So that's the basis. Now, on the third column in the slides, you can see that there are many old vaccines having been developed based on these platforms. The oldest, of course, is attenuated. Inactivated virus has been around for a long time. The old Hep A and the old rabies virus are based on that. Protein subunit, of course, has been around for a long time. The famous influenza virus, as many of you probably get once a year or so, that's basically a protein subunit, a protein subunit vaccine. Virus-like particle has been used for HPV, human papillomavirus, as well as for hepatitis B. The really two new ones are the viral vector, or the nucleic acid-based vaccine, as well as viral vector vaccine. And these are newish technology. They are nevertheless, in fact, the first vaccine being developed for COVID-19, which I've explained later on. As you can see, in fact, the viral vector vaccine has been used to develop the 2 Ebola vaccines that are now available. No human vaccine ever been developed yet based on mRNA. However, there are 2 animal virus. There are 2 animal virus vaccine based on this particular technology. So there you are. There are basically 5 platform technologies currently being employed to develop variety of COVID-19 vaccine by a variety of manufacturers. And subsequently, I'll summarize some of the product characteristics that are based on this platform later on. Okay, next please. So, next please. A few quick words about mechanism. I think this is probably the part that most of us get pretty bored with. So in this case, I take simply an inactivated virus. And this schema is just based on one inactivated virus. And it has an adjuvant called the CpG adjuvant. So that's the one that is used. Some of this virus platform, including inactivated virus, including protein subunit, including, in fact, in this case, inactivated virus, they are relatively less immunogenic compared to, say, vaccine produced using mRNA or using viral vector. So we generally have to combine them with an adjuvant. An adjuvant is just something we use to stimulate the uptake of the antigen. In this case, the blue cells there, that's called an APC, antigen presenting cells. So as you probably remember from immunology class, the APC has to uptake the antigen, including, of course, the adjuvant, and then it processed that. And having processed that, it subsequently then present the antigen in the context of MHC. And that presentation is to, of course, to B cells, as well as to T cells. And the T cells then go on to activate the B cells to produce the neutralizing antibodies. The T cells themselves also play a role to some extent in so-called cell-mediated immunity. So that's basically the mechanisms of how injecting a vaccine or injecting an antigen with an adjuvant cause us to produce neutralizing antibody or induce an immune response by us as the host to that particular antigen, in this case, of course, for COVID-19, the spike protein. So we are now able to produce neutralizing antibodies against spike protein, having now just been exposed, in this case, only to an inactivated virus with an adjuvant. Okay, so that's, if you like, the immunologic mechanism behind how a vaccine induces the immune response in us. Next, please. I won't bore you with such details. So come back to the bigger question then. How does vaccination protect us? Well, it basically protects us at two levels. At one level, of course, it's a very personal level. I receive a vaccine, that vaccine is out to protect me against being infected by COVID-19, right? So we call that personal protection. It will lower the risk of infection, and more importantly, in fact, it lowers the risk of getting severe disease if in the event that you were infected. And that's important. That's important, of course, for the recipient of the vaccine. However, getting people vaccinated also confer so-called community vaccine protection. And this is through the so-called herd immunity mechanism. If you get enough people vaccinated in a population, then there's much less chance now of the virus being transmitted within that population, and therefore we achieve so-called herd immunity. So even if you don't receive the vaccine, the fact that people around you, most of them have received the vaccine, confers some protection for you. And that's the community level protection. Okay. Now, next please. So that's how we understand by how vaccination protects us individually as well as a community. So here you are. We have many vaccines now from US, two or three from China, one from India by Biotech, but even one is Russian one, Sputnik 5. And of course, but most of the rest obviously are the big name vaccines, Pfizer, J&J, Novavax, AstraZeneca. These are big pharma companies. And obviously they've gotten into the act of producing the vaccines. And in some sense, we are glad that they got the act together and they're able to get the vaccine out so quickly in less than a year. That's pretty amazing fit to me. Next, please. So what about this vaccine? We call these the front-running vaccines, right? They started their trials way back in March, April last year, and by the end of the year, they were able to complete their phase 3 trials in amazing record time. Okay, but then these are not the only companies producing vaccine. There are many more companies in the running. Unfortunately, they are a bit late, so we call them the back-running vaccines. And many of these vaccines, many of these manufacturers, in fact, are now coming to Malaysia to conduct their phase 3 trials. Well, we have a lot of COVID in Malaysia, unfortunately. So there you are. I'm sure you may have seen some of this advert. And this gentleman there from Sungai Petani is the first Malaysian, in fact, to receive a vaccine. But he received the vaccine in the context of this first trial, this first vaccine trial in Malaysia. We are now running a lot more trials. So we like to send. I like to send a message out to my colleagues, to my medical colleagues. If you're interested to participate in clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccine, just call me, just text me, please. Okay, my number is down there. So, Dr. Ara, so sorry for this little advertising, all right? But then, I just want to do my job to get this message out to my medical colleagues. And there is an opportunity now for more Malaysian doctors to get involved in clinical trials, okay? For COVID-19 vaccine. Next, please. So, a quick summary on this vaccine. Right on top there, I put down the name of the companies. I have Pfizer and Moderna there, and these two companies, of course, has an mRNA vaccine. And I've explained to you mRNA vaccine just now. Then, of course, we have AstraZeneca, Oxford, and we have J&J, newly approved adenoviral vector vaccine, right? For AstraZeneca case, in fact, it's a chimpanzee adenovirus, right? Interestingly. However, for J&J, it still is the human adenovirus. And then the third column there, I have Novavax, a newly approved vaccine again, and that's a protein subunit vaccine. And lastly, I have two Chinese companies producing the good old-fashioned inactivated virus vaccine combined with an adjuvant, in this case, in our element. So the 4 types of vaccine, a few companies producing these vaccines. These are all approved vaccines. They are currently available in some markets. In Malaysia, we now have Pfizer, we have AstraZeneca. I think we have government just approved Sinovac as well. The technology behind it. So the Pfizer mRNA vaccine obviously is very, very new technology. It's now actually been used in producing any human vaccine at all. So there's no prior approved human vaccine based on mRNA. For the very first time, we are using such a technology to produce human vaccine. The vector vaccine is also newish, even though there have been in fact 2 Ebola vaccines based on this particular technology. Then the protein subunit vaccine, of course, is very old thing, a very old-fashioned thing. So it's been around for a long, long time. Many existing vaccines, and similarly for inactivated virus, many existing vaccines based on this particular technology. Now, a quick words about the development. Some of you may wonder, how could Pfizer come up with a vaccine in less than 9 months? Well, because they use mRNA, right? mRNA has that advantage of quick design, and you could quickly get from design. And as soon as the sequence of the virus was published way back in January, within 2 months, they've done most of the bench work, actually. And they were able to move on so quickly into phase 1 and 2 human trials. And that's because mRNA is easy to tweak and to design. It is also highly scalable. The same production process could be scaled up very quickly to produce a huge amount. And Pfizer is now producing literally billions of doses of the virus. So it was a nice technology that was just being there at the right time when this pandemic occurred. Now, you compare that with adenovirus, it's also highly scalable. The last 2 vaccines, unfortunately, are not so easily scalable. So they're taking a long time to come out. And now having gone through the phase 3 trial, they are just now being rolled out. And I think the supply is probably going to be limited. And the last row is the immune response. And I think that's important to know. Do note that both mRNA and the vector vaccine induces both humoral and cellular responses. Now, traditionally, we are primarily concerned with neutralizing antibodies response, right? When we induce an immune response through vaccination, we like to see a high titer neutralizing antibodies, but not forgetting, in fact, that cellular immune response probably also is important, even though we're not so good at measuring it. And I personally suspect that that's probably why Pfizer could achieve such amazing high efficacy of 95%. That's almost literally unheard of. And they were able to achieve it, and this is a brand new vaccine platform. Similarly, the vector vaccine also induces both humoral and cellular responses. The big problem, of course, here is that you're using a cold virus, adenovirus. That's a human virus. And you could therefore induce, or there could therefore be pre-existing immunity against adenovirus, and that will compromise the efficacy of the vaccine. Well, that's the reason why, in fact, AstraZeneca uses chimpanzee adenovirus instead of human adenovirus as the vector. Then for virus subunit, protein subunit, as well as inactivated virus, unfortunately, they are not that immunogenic, okay? So, but then that's why, of course, you almost always use those vaccines together with an adjuvant, try to boost the immunogenicity. The inactivated virus also has the advantage, of course, that it produces a somewhat autologous and polyclonal response, which means that neutralizing antibodies produced by this vaccine will act against a variety of antigen. Well, simply because the inactivated virus expresses a variety of antigen and not just one specific antigen, like say a spike protein, right? So given this characteristic about this vaccine, next, let's see the results. Next, please. So here you are. That's the results. Some of the characteristics as well as the result that we know about this vaccine today. We know that Pfizer vaccine and Mrna vaccine require 2 doses, a first priming dose followed by a booster dose. Well, I'm sure some of you may be aware the data just came out last week that potentially now Pfizer vaccine could be done on a single dose. J&J vaccine obviously is famously a single dose vaccine. However, the protein vaccine as well as inactivated virus vaccine, they almost always require 2 doses, simply because they are not that fantastically immunogenic. The route, all vaccine uses intramuscular injection for administration as a route of administration into a human body. Some of you may have heard about the intranasal as well as the oral vaccine now being developed for adenovirus-based vector vaccine. Then the cold chain, of course, Pfizer would require ultra cold chain of -17 degrees, even though, of course, lately now they're able to fine-tune They are able to fine-tune the product, and increasingly they could now ship this thing and store this thing at lower temperature. Similarly, the vector vaccine also require fairly cold. The two good old-fashioned vaccines only require standard cold chain of 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. Now the efficacy results, and you see for mRNA, both in fact Moderna and Pfizer reported extremely high efficacy of 95% now. That's just literally unheard of, right? It's just amazing. I mean, 95% efficacy, personal protection. Okay, there was question about whether they induce a sterilizing immunity, which means basically that being able to protect yourself, being vaccinated, you are also able to protect others through reduction in transmission or through reduction in shedding of virus. This called sterilizing immunity. And data are just emerging now that both the mRNA virus vaccine as well as the vector vaccine do achieve to some degree of sterilizing immunity. And that, of course, is important for achieving herd immunity. If you want herd immunity, it's not just good enough. It's just not good enough that that individually, personally, we are protected by the vaccine. We must also stop transmitting the virus. And that then provide the basis for achieving herd immunity. And so, well, we generally expect to see that, all right? But it's just the data is taking time to come out because all countries are rushing to approve the vaccine so that the population can start being injected. Now, for Novavax vector protein vaccine, it's achieving 90%, and not surprisingly, inactivated virus vaccine tend to have lowish kind of efficacy. Like I said, they tend not to be that immunogenic. Now I put down there a downward arrow in red and B1351. B1351, some of you may know, is the famous variant from South Africa. And in fact, for all three Novavax, Astra, as well as Pfizer vaccines, they have all now shown very large reduction in efficacy against this particular variant from South Africa. I'll tell you more about the variant later on, but I think it's a cause of concern. We know now that these vaccines are now in the market, and many of us are going to be injected with. They will not be good for B1351. And in the event that B1351 will arrive one day in Malaysia, it hasn't yet arrived yet. I don't know. No one is telling us that I mean, I'm sure the government is doing genomic surveillance, but no one is telling us the results yet. I hope it hasn't arrived yet, and I hope it won't ever arrive. Finally, on safety, all these vaccines have demonstrated a remarkable safety profile to date. I'm sure you read about some acute anaphylaxis occurring here and there, but you're talking about events that occurs in the region of like 3 or 4 per million population kind of incidents, all right? Yeah, extremely rare right now. They're all very safe. Next, please. So this is a safety. Pfizer vaccine has been around, and I think more than 50 million people now have been injected with Pfizer vaccine. So there's huge database now on adverse event profile. You can look at it. Most people you would expect will have injection site pain, they get fatigue, maybe they develop fever, and you notice that the second dose will cause more adverse event than the first dose. And in fact, you want to see adverse event. In fact, if you don't see adverse event, chances are probably that vaccine hasn't been immunogenic anywhere. So it's nice to see some adverse effect. I mean, we call it adverse effect, but that's basically your body reaction to the vaccine. Next, please. So I have summarized the data, right? I've summarized the data from the clinical trial. All the clinical trials have been published to date for Pfizer, Moderna, J&J. Sinopharm's data are still not published, okay? So these are just data that we abstract from the news. Now, as you know, there's a difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is what you observe in a clinical trial. Effectiveness is what you observe in the real world. And this was just, I think, published 1 or 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal. Israel as a country, obviously, some of you may know, is the most progressive in terms of getting this population vaccinated. We have already, I think, vaccinated more than half of the population in Israel. So they published this data on more than 1 million people, more than 1 million Israelis vaccinated over the last 2 months or so. And then they compare people who are vaccinated versus people who are not vaccinated, simply because no country can vaccinate everybody instantaneously. There will always be some people who are not vaccinated. And so they do a matched control studies. And what happened? They observed 94% effectiveness in preventing COVID. And they observed 92% effectiveness effectiveness against severe COVID. That's more or less replicating the results you observe in the clinical trial. So in this case, effectiveness equal efficacy. That's pretty amazing result to me. So there you are. It works, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it anymore that it works in clinical trial. It works in the real world. The result has been consistent, in fact, in all groups, whether in elderly, in young people. And so that's really nice to know that this vaccine works in the real population, and not just in the artificial population assembled for clinical trial purposes. Next, please. So let me say a few words about emerging variants. So you know that RNA viruses, such as this coronavirus, they do mutate. Okay, they're not as nasty as flu virus. Flu virus is just so prone to mutating because it's a segmented virus, right? And therefore they are prone to recombinations. So very new mutations arise all the time. For this coronavirus, obviously, they also have some proofreading capability. So when you're replicating the DNA sequences, sometimes you could mistype. You can have a typo error, and there is a proofreading step to correct some of this typo error in the DNA sequence. So it's not that really prone to mutation, but nevertheless under selective pressure, and they are under selective pressure because we vaccinated the population. We are deliberately inducing neutralizing antibodies against these viruses, and therefore they are now less able to infect cells, right? And so mutation will, therefore, they are under selective pressure to mutate, and some of these viruses, in fact, do begin to mutate. And the most nasty one turns out to be the E484K mutation that occurs in this green part of it. You can see the green part. You can see what's depicted there in the diagram is a spike protein, right? The spike protein has this region, the green region there, and that's called the RBD, the receptor binding domain. So that's a specific part of the spike protein that's responsible for engaging the ACE receptors on the cells in our throat and in our lung linings, and they cause then the coronavirus to enter into our cells. That part, and that is the critical part, and a lot of the vaccines were designed specifically against using those parts of the spike protein as the antigen, and thereby inducing a neutralizing antibody response, so that the neutralizing antibody then prevent the virus from entering our cells using the spike protein ACE receptors mechanism. And not surprisingly, therefore, we are observing mutations specifically in these critical parts of the virus. And the most nasty one, in fact, another E484K virus mutation that's now observed in this South African variant. And that's the one that's ultimately now responsible for the diminishing efficacy of the vaccines that we have. Next, please. So that's just biological data. And here, I think this was just published, I think about a few weeks ago. And sure enough, they went on to do a trial. In this case, I think this is AstraZeneca's vaccine, the Astra. And so they did a trial in South Africa. Remember, the B1351 variant is the predominant variant now in South Africa, right? I don't know why it's a dominant variant in Malaysia. We don't get to see such data. But in South Africa now, that's the dominant variant. And that's the variant with that mutation I showed in the last slide. And when they did this trial, what happened? Well, 93% infection due to B1351 variant. So this is infection occurring among people who were vaccinated, right? In this trial. And vaccine efficacy has dropped down to 10.4% only. But that's pretty amazing, huh? You think about it. So, I mean, AstraZeneca vaccine has an efficacy of 90% or 95%, or 90%, let's say. But against this particular variant, this first trial from South Africa now showed the efficacy has more or less disappeared. Next, please. So I know that's scary, but then on the other hand, we don't know yet. So regardless of what happened, whether those variant has arrived yet in Malaysia, let's just all go out there and get our vaccine, please. As for those of you who can't get your vaccine on time, well, please do sign up for this trial. I'm now running this trial. We hope to start this trial next month in April. I'd like to get more doctors to involve in clinical trials. And now we have an opportunity to do a lot of clinical trial, vaccine trial in Malaysia. Please contact me if you're interested. And there are more companies coming. Anaphylaxis from China, again, Clover Pharma, Valneva from France, Austria. So Everybody loves Malaysia. Everybody loves to come to Malaysia to do that COVID-19 vaccine trial because we simply have so much COVID-19. Next, please. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Dr. Lim, thank you very much. I think we've been muted accidentally. Thank you very much for that wonderful, insightful, and succinct presentation, sharing with us all the, I think, very critically necessary data for us to understand very quickly everything to do with COVID-19 vaccines and the landscape at present. Doctor, we would like to kind of invite you to hold on because there are quite a few questions coming your way, and we'd like to run through the rest of the panelists first, and then we can field these questions together. Thank you so much, Doctor. We'd like to invite our next panelist, Dr. Benedict Sim. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Benedict. He is a consultant infectious disease physician at University Malaya Medical Center. And this evening, Dr. Ben will speak to us about the clinical kind of points in managing COVID-19 vaccination. Dr. Ben, I would like to turn the stage over to you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is my screen being shown?
Yes, it is, Dr. Ben. Please go ahead.
Right. So I think there's going to be a bit of overlap between what I will present and what Dr. Lim has presented. So I'll skip over the parts where Dr. Lim has presented. And basically, I'm just for outline for objectives to this talk would be is a vaccine really needed, and what's the efficacy of the vaccine, which I think largely has been covered by Dr. Lim. What are some of the safety concerns? I'll go into a bit more detail, and what is the role of all of us as doctors in this vaccine rollout. So this is I wanted to take you all first through this Malaysian data. So the way we look at it would be to start from the bottom here, and this were the first 6,000 patients in Malaysia who had COVID-19, and out of them, half of them were asymptomatic, and 50% of them went on to develop symptoms. And out of those who developed symptoms, about 80 to 90% of them had mild to moderate illness. Okay, that means they didn't need oxygen. The definition of mild to severe disease is they need oxygen. So these patients, some of them had pneumonia, some of them had a URTI, but they didn't need any oxygen. 12% of them went on to need oxygen. And, and out of those who actually needed oxygen, 2/3 of them actually ended up in ICU. And out of 62%, out of this 62% of them who went into ICU, 1/3 of them didn't make it out, and 2/3 of them recovered. Now, the reason why I'm bringing you through this is because I think one of the first concerns that people have about vaccines is, do we really need this? Are we really making too much of a fuss about COVID-19? And is it, after all, like, the mortality for COVID-19 is think between 0.4 to 1% or so of the population, and people quote diseases like influenza and road traffic accidents and all of that, and show that there are more people that die from these diseases, or just as many people die from these diseases. So I just wanted to bring you through this slide, firstly to sort of like have a paradigm that we look at it from this paradigm. The overall risk of dying from COVID-19 in Malaysia appears to be between 0.4% to 1%. That is if you count everybody in the same boat, all right? But once you get COVID-19, and if you fall into this category, and many of this category will not even be detected currently in Malaysia, because currently, as you know, with our current outbreak, there are many more patients with severe disease, and many more patients with symptomatic disease, because we are unable to carry out as much contact tracing as we would like to, compared to the earlier outbreak. Yeah. So many people actually come down with symptoms because we are maybe not detecting so many of those who are asymptomatic. So once you are here, your risk of severe disease is no longer, your risk of death is no longer 0.4%. It has actually moved up to another notch. And if you are unlucky enough to actually get severe disease, which 12% out of these patients with symptoms get, then suddenly your risk of mortality is much higher than 0.4%. 62% of people will go on to require being in ICU, and out of the 62%, 1/3 of them will actually die. Okay, so how we view this overall mortality for COVID has to be fine-tuned to which category of disease you are actually in. So here I put it in a simple cartoon form. So you got death at 0.4%. People with severe disease means they need oxygen, is about 8%. And then you've got 40% of them who have mild disease, and 50% of them who are actually well or asymptomatic. The other thing to note is also the mortality is not the same across the board. It really depends a lot on age group as well. Over here, you see that if you are a young person below the age of 30, then yes, the mortality rate is actually very small. In fact, below the age of 20 is really very, very small. In fact, that's the thing that skews the graph a lot and gives us the overall mortality of 0.4%. So up to the age of 30 is still 0.15%. Once you reach in your fourth decade of life, I don't know whether you call this a third or the fourth decade of life, and it's 0.5%. It goes up to 1% if you are in my age group. If you are in the 50s to 60s, it goes up to 2%. Once you reach here, above the age of 70, that's 1 in 8 people dying of COVID, regardless of whatever we do. And there's a 22% mortality if you are above the age of 80 years old. Okay, so the risk of dying from COVID is not uniform across the board. Okay? So I want to make the case of that instead of looking at death itself, which is overall a small figure, all right, we should actually be looking at severe disease, and that's for several reasons. Number one, severe disease means that you're going to stay in hospital longer, that chances are you will be infected for a longer time. You will have a risk of complications of COVID, which is much more than just respiratory disease. And there is a significant chance that you may end up in ICU and have a pretty miserable time there. All right. So this is the risk of getting severe disease means these people need oxygen. Again, age plays a big role. If you are, let's say, 40 to 50 years old, you've got a 5% chance. So 1 in 20 people between the age of 40 to 50 actually go on to need oxygen. All right. Once you are between the ages of 60 to 70, 10% of people go on to need oxygen. Once you are 70 to 80, it's about a quarter of people go on to need oxygen. And it is not purely race, age as well. There's also whether you've got comorbidities. And what do I mean by comorbidities? This is a snapshot of some of the comorbidities we collected: hypertension, diabetes, chronic heart disease, and obesity. Obesity is defined as BMI more than 30, or chronic kidney disease, or lung disease. So if you're less than 40 and you don't have any comorbids, the chances of you having severe disease is 5 in 1,000. That goes up by tenfold if you are below 40 but have a comorbidity, which puts you almost at the same range as somebody 40 to 60 without any comorbidities. 40 to 60 with comorbidities gives you a 10% risk of getting severe disease, which is higher even than somebody above the age of 60 without any comorbidities. These are some of the other complications of COVID that you can get. And over here, you can see that the likelihood of getting these complications are high. So you get post-intensive care syndrome. And post-intensive care syndrome, if you do go into ICU, very often we need very high doses of steroids to get you to recover, and almost everybody who leaves ICU has to go through a period of rehabilitation because they have a lot of myopathies and critical illness, weakness, and neuropathies as well. You can get venous thromboembolisms, which can lead to pulmonary embolisms. There's quite a lot of cardiovascular complications. We see myocardial infarctions, we see strokes happening almost every day in our hospital. Acute kidney injury is also fairly common. And then you've got medium likelihood of getting acute liver injury, neurological complications, and long COVID and cardiac arrest and all that. This is one study. There are many studies like this now. This is, I think, one of those that showed the longest follow-up time. 6 months after getting COVID, many people are actually still symptomatic. The symptoms are non-specific. Many of them is lethargy, or brain fog, and or the ongoing cough. But people actually can get symptoms right until 6 months later. This is I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this place called Manaus. Manaus is a city in inner Brazil. It's up the Amazon River, so it's away from the big cities of Brazil, but so it's upstream in the Amazon River, and but the city itself has got like 2 million people, and in around the middle of last year, they had a very bad bout of COVID going through that city, and it was reported that almost 70% of people actually died in that city, and these are the mass coffins that were laid out, and Manaus actually thought that they were over the worst, and by the end of last year, they actually released all their restrictions, and people could do whatever they want anymore because they thought that there was already herd immunity. Sorry, it wasn't 70% of people that died. Actually, 70% of people had been infected by COVID. Sorry, but every day the city was seeing like 70 to 90 people dying. But when January came around this year, they actually had a second bout of severe COVID by another variant, and this time the death rates in January of 2021 was higher even than that in the middle of last year. So the reason why I put up this slide is because sometimes people are tempted to go and talk about natural herd immunity, whereby just let people get COVID and then we get immune on our own. It doesn't seem to be the case, at least if we look at the story of Manaus. Okay, I won't go through this slide. I think we've gone through the vaccine efficacy as what Dr. Lim has showed us. Okay, I won't go through this. So I think Dr. Lim has mentioned this as well. I think when we vaccinate somebody, firstly, we are protecting them as an individual. Secondly, we are protecting the loved ones or those who are vulnerable, who are close to them, whether the elderly or whether if they are a doctor and in charge of other patients, we are protecting their patients as well. And thirdly, the third level of protection is actually if there are enough people in the community who are vaccinated, then those who for some reason or another cannot be vaccinated, we are sort of like surrounding them with vaccinated people so they can never get the virus. So that's herd immunity. Okay, these are the vaccines in Malaysia. I think Dr. Lim went through some of the emerging variants and their concern. I think we heard about the B1351. I think today in Malaysia, we reported that there were 2 cases of, I think it's B525, which shares this E484K mutation. So that's a concerning thing because we are worried that with this mutation, the vaccines will be less efficacious. Okay. Again, Dr. Lim has shown you the mainly most of the side effects from this is for the Pfizer vaccine. It lasts less than a week. By the time you reach 6-7 days, the side effects have petered out. Most people get the side effects after in the first 24 hours. The side effects are higher after the second dose of the vaccine. I just wanted to point out here that chills is one of the side effects to this vaccine, because I think it's probably one of the more unusual side effects to come out from a vaccine, which is actually chills. Quite a lot of people have complained about that. This is from the clinical trials, and down here is what side effects they actually get. These are the local side effects: pain at the injection site, redness, swelling, and these as fever, fatigue, headache, chills, and all that. And the different color bars here are to actually show how severe the symptoms are. Green, that means it's very mild. Blue, that means it's a bit more severe. Orange, that means it's felt quite strongly, and there are some that are what we call as category 4 side effects, which are extremely rare. You can't even see the red at the top of it, but the red are those with category 4 side effects where they actually need to get admitted into hospital. But by far and large, people do get the vaccines do get side effects. Interesting to note that people who get the placebo salt water injection also get quite a bit of side effects from here. Yeah, so when we look at the side effects, we probably have to take away the background noise of side effects coming from any injection. Now, perhaps I'll go through this a bit more because Dr. Lim didn't have time to share this. The one main side effect I think that we are concerned about in for at least the Pfizer vaccine is anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis, and in the post-marketing surveillance report came out from the US. It was quoting 4.7 in 1 million, whereas Mrna was 2.5 in 1 million. Those numbers are probably a little bit conservative because they were very stringent in who they actually call getting an anaphylactic reaction. We've got reports coming from Singapore. Singapore have also been using Pfizer vaccine. I think their rates is about 3 in 100,000. So that means in 1 million is maybe about 30 people. And that's probably about the type of magnitude of anaphylaxis or anaphylactic-like side effects that we will see. Yeah. So the main contraindications to somebody getting Pfizer vaccine, firstly, is if you have had a Pfizer vaccine before. Most of us haven't, but if you have got one and you had an allergic reaction to it, then you're not supposed to get the Pfizer second dose. If you have had a history of anaphylaxis, and anaphylaxis means that you've got severe angioedema, let's say swelling in the oral mucosa, bronchospasms or hypotension, and this can occur whether it's to other drugs or vaccines or food or insect bites, then it is a contraindication to get the Pfizer vaccine. If you've got an acute febrile illness, so at the moment you are unwell because you've got dengue or something like that, then we also suggest that you don't get the vaccine at that point. Then you wait until you have completely recovered and are back to your usual activities before you get the vaccine. I think this caution comes out because of what was observed. Many of you would have read the concerns that there was mortalities that happened in old folks' homes in Europe. I think Norway had a few, and Germany and Spain, I think, had a few. And investigations are still going on. But one of the preliminary things that came out, they said that some of the people who received those vaccines and didn't had a severe reaction actually were unwell at that point. They probably had other infections and all that were happening. Yeah? So I won't be able to go into the details of the comments of people with anaphylaxis, but yeah, but there is a caution over there. Yeah? So it's based on these reports that came out of US. At least 2 reports have come out looking at the side effects, and they are very detailed in these side effects of or these anaphylaxis reactions that have happened in US. And so I've just summarized it here. So between December 14 to January 18, there were almost 10 million Pfizer vaccines given out, 7.5 million Mrna vaccines given out, 66 anaphylaxis, out of which 34 people were hospitalized. The remainder were given adrenaline injections and were discharged from immediately. Out of the 34 who were hospitalized, 13 had to go into ICU, 7 were intubated. None of them died. At the point of reporting, 61 had been discharged from hospital, 5 of them were still stuck in hospital. So this was the overall rates that I mentioned. There seems to be a female preponderance, and I'm not an immunologist, so I don't claim to know this in detail, but apparently the risk is higher among females of reproductive age, and it's probably something to do with estrogen and sort of like predisposes female reproduction age to be higher risk of getting anaphylaxis. For the Pfizer vaccine, a third of them had prior anaphylaxis to other agents before in the past, and 77% of them had prior allergies prior to getting the vaccine. And so the majority of them actually had either anaphylaxis or allergies to other things before. Most people, if they get anaphylaxis, it was within 10 minutes, and almost all of them within half an hour, which is why the advisory is after you get the vaccine to be observed for half an hour. There's actually many tables. So this comes from a letter from the Ministry of Health. I can circulate it around to. It was circulated around to all the state pengaras, and from there it's supposed to be disseminated out. So it has many. It's a very long table. I think about 4 pages long table. So they go into the details about if a patient is immunocompromised, what happens, if a patient has got HIV, what happens, for pregnant women, what happens, people with blood disorders, can they get the IM injection, what happens, and then who is at risk of getting a severe disease, okay, chronic respiratory illness, heart disease and all that, okay, diabetes and all that. These are higher risk, so these people should be prioritized on getting the vaccine. Finally, I just want to mention that so that's about the contraindications to vaccine and who should be prioritized to get vaccine. However, the risk of everybody has a different amount of risk. One is the risk of being infected with COVID. So for all of you out there, you are frontliners, you are at risk of being infected with COVID. Some among us may actually have other comorbidities or age against us, so we are at risk of having severe disease. All right, so one is the risk of getting COVID, the other is the risk of getting severe disease, and the third is the risk of spreading the disease to vulnerable populations. Perhaps you stay with elderly people at your home, or you're a doctor in hospital that treats a lot of elderly folk. So if you get COVID, you may have very mild COVID, but the people whom you spread it to may actually succumb to the disease. Yeah? Okay. So so based on that, not everybody's risk is the same. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is because for some patients, even though they've got some allergies, if they are the general population, I may choose to wait and not vaccinate them until later on when other vaccines, more data comes out. But if a patient is a frontliner, or if a patient has got is living with somebody with a lot of vulnerable population, then he goes up in the line that we will, even though that he has got a slightly higher risk of anaphylaxis, I may actually give him the vaccine. Okay, so it's not completely black and white. All right. With that, I thank you.
Dr. Ben, thank you so much. I think what was very enlightening is the way you provided us with Malaysian data and made the case for everyone to actually kind of accept the vaccine, to get vaccinated, and most importantly, I think we need to become vaccine advocates onto our patients as well. Right, lovely, doctor. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions heading your way as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to direct the clinical kind of based questions towards you, doctor, if you don't mind. Lovely. So I'm just going to get the next panelist to come on board, and then we'll come back to you really shortly. Thank you so much, doctor. Next, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Mr. J. Padasian. Mr. J. Padasian is a UK qualified registered pharmacist, and he's got more than 25 years of experience within the biotech, the healthcare industries. Among the various positions that Mr. J has held is as Vice President Healthcare at Malaysian Biotech Corp. And he's currently a consultant both to the government as well as private sectors on a wide number of industries. And he also is currently active committee member for National Key Economic Area Healthcare, as well as government advisor for various concerns, as well as currently a member of the National Experts Group Technology Development for Vaccines. So Mr. J is tonight speaking to us and providing us with a global perspective, and he's coming from this aspect to speak to us and what does this mean for us as medical professionals. Mr. J, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us, and the stage is all yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murali. Hi, good evening, everyone. Yeah, hope everyone's still awake at this point of time. Today, basically, I'm going to, after Dr. Lim's and Dr. Sim's talk, a lot of the stuff that they've covered, I'm covering it in a little bit different angle, yeah. And basically, I would like to focus on some of the components pertaining to the actual global race for this COVID-19 vaccines. Yeah, it's simply amazing in terms of what they've actually done within a short span of time, to develop the vaccines, as well as share some of the developing news or information that we are getting on these vaccines as well. Yeah. Here, if you actually look at the typical vaccine development, it would take quite a long time, easily another 13 years, 13 years, yeah. And in fact, if you look at the previous record for vaccine development, it was way back in 1967, yeah, with the mumps vaccine, and that took 4 years, yeah. When this article came out in the New York Times last year, in April, they actually estimated that it would actually take quite a bit of time before they would actually be able to come out with a COVID-19 vaccine. Yeah, in fact, they were looking at the earliest estimation was by August 2021. We know that that's not true. Essentially, there's quite a few vaccines already in place. And if you look at the latest, and this is updated just a few days ago, coronavirus vaccine tracker, there's actually roughly 100 over, yeah, projects in total, yeah, of which there are about 78 active projects which are in the preclinical stage. In terms of clinical trials, there's actually 71 active trials at this point of time. The 4 key technology platforms that we see primarily seen, especially the one that has been authorized or approved. And if you again, if you look at this in a little bit greater detail, yeah. So these are the 12 leading vaccines that are actually in the market, yeah. And of which Malaysia has so far selected 5 of them, yeah. For those who don't know or can't remember, there are of course the Pfizer one that came into play first. And then the ones that are coming up shortly, yeah, we have, of course, the Sinovac vaccine, the Gamaleya one, the Sputnik vaccine is actually coming up as well. And the company that I'm actually with, the director with called Solution Biologics, yeah, it's actually going to do a fill finish of the CanSino vaccine at TPM, yeah, Technology Park Malaysia in KL. So whenever we talk about vaccines, yeah, and if you look at whenever you speak to any of your patients or any of your even family members, friends, and all that, yeah, the talk that has been domineering in the press, of course, has always been talking about efficacy, and more efficacy, yeah. However, efficacy does not translate directly into effectiveness of a vaccine. And this is an interesting proposition where I'd like to say that and to select an effective COVID-19 vaccine is like selecting a decathlon athlete. Yeah. For those who don't know what a decathlon sport is, basically it's basically a sport where you have 10 different disciplines. Yeah. And these are actually done over 2 days. And just like a decathlon athlete, if we were to select a decathlon athlete for the different sports, a COVID-19 vaccine, we would actually have to look from different parameters as well. This slide is a little bit busy, yeah. So I just like to maybe focus on some of the different points. If you look at the 100-meter sprint, we'll look at the overall efficacy, for example. In terms of WHO have actually set a 50% target for any vaccines to actually clear. And there's many reasons for this, yeah. And if you look at the efficacy that's actually coming out, and I think that has been elucidated quite well by Dr. Lim and Dr. Sim earlier. They are also affected by when this sites or when this trial was actually conducted, as well as where it was conducted, yeah. And the reason being is the appearance of the variants that was also discussed quite extensively earlier. Yeah. The second portion, which basically for a vaccine, a COVID-19 vaccine to be successful, and it's important to remind ourselves that this is actually one of the key end goals. Yeah, is to actually have a vaccine that is that has a good efficacy rate against severe disease. Yeah. And this is where you have a certain percentage efficacy to prevent the severe disease and basically reduce COVID-19 to a manageable disease. Yeah, pretty much like the diseases that you have these days, which are controlled by the various vaccines that are available. Yeah. The third component, yeah, is the safety profile. Yeah, as mentioned earlier, the previous record for vaccine development is 4 years. Yeah. None of the vaccines that are in the market right now have gone beyond the threshold 12 months. Yeah, and because of that, we have to be especially acutely aware of the severe adverse effects that one can see. Yeah. Additionally, some of these are also changing as we go. In terms of storage temperatures, this has been discussed quite extensively already. Yeah. In terms of number of doses. Basically, a WHO expert group has actually said that an efficacious 1-dose vaccine at 70%, for example, is probably more impactful than a 2-dose vaccine with a 90% efficacy. Yeah, and that is why I think if you look at the data as well, even groups like Pfizer and all that are actually trying to see what the efficacy is like at the first dose. Yeah, because this is certainly impactful. In terms of suitability of age, for those aged above 60, it's important to know that not all vaccines are actually licensed for above 60. A lot of them are actually geared from 18 to 60. And it really depends on the clinical trial cohort, yeah. And primarily because I'm actually representing them as well. The CanSino one actually managed to get that approval. In terms of suitability for below 18, yeah. At this point of time, none of the vaccines have actually got this approval, yeah. Quite a number of the different vaccines trials, some of them are actually looking at patients below 18 at this juncture. The one I'm looking at, for example, have been having patients since September, yeah, but because it's patients below 18, that particular cohort, they're actually letting it run till for 12 months. And essentially, we would be able to see more information by then. The established technology component is actually something very important. For those who are familiar with the thalidomide story, yeah, basically that basically is what kind of alerted everybody to the community to put stringent requirements for clinical trials. A drug back in the 50s, which was used for depression and all that, was then they found that it was useful for nausea, and because of that, they started using it in pregnant women. Unfortunately, it actually led to a whole series of issues, yeah, where there were congenital defects, where the limbs of the babies were either missing or shortened, yeah. And the reason why I wanted to remind people about this is we don't know what we don't know at this juncture, yeah. So it's always better to be safe than sorry when it comes to technology. So some of the technology platforms that's out there at the moment are more established than others. Yeah, and we would certainly want to see more data coming out. The second last component is the performance against variants. Yeah, again, I won't go too much about that because that was covered a lot earlier. And then finally, we also would really need to look at pricing, but again, it's a subject I won't cover tonight. Okay, so I won't go too much into this. The gist of it, these are the 4 key technologies that are actually in Malaysia. It's covered pretty much by the other speakers already. Yeah, I just like to highlight, and primarily because out of the 5, there are actually 3 different viral vector vaccines that are likely to be used once it's approved by NPRA. Yeah, and each of these viral vector vaccines are actually quite different. Yeah, and it's important to note that when we actually talk about that. And in terms of some of the issues coming out as seen in the clinical trials, it is really dependent on whether it's what type of adenovirus they actually utilize, whether it's the chimpanzee version of the adeno5, the adeno5 itself, or the adenovirus 26 version. Yeah, and it's important to know that as you see some of your patients coming back, to basically understand which particular vaccine that they were actually vaccinated with, and not just a generic viral vector or what have you. Yeah. If we were to kind of transplant that so-called how we select an effective COVID-19 vaccine, it's very important to actually understand how that would actually look from a profile basis, you know, when we kind of transplant them. And if you notice, none of these vaccines are perfect in any way. Yeah, each has its strengths, each has its weakness. Yeah, here I'm actually looking on an overall basis, comparing 3 of the ones that are likely to be used in Malaysia. The Mrna, of course, is the Pfizer one, adenovirus, as well as the inactivated for the Sinovac one. Yeah. Okay, so why is all this important? There's a lot of concerns, and this is actually going back to August 2020. There was actually a survey pertaining to Malaysians, you know, in terms of whether they would take the vaccine or not take the vaccine. Yeah. Of course, these days we actually have live data. As of this morning, for example, there's only about 1 million people who've actually registered for vaccination. But of course, Malaysians are notorious to be very last minute, and very inclined towards, you know, maybe having some sort of stick to kind of push people. You know, we are coming to so-called tax season soon, yeah, and you can bet that a lot of them would actually go on the very last moment to register and for the vaccination, yeah. But saying that, there are quite a number of areas of why people basically actually not thinking of not taking the vaccines. And one of the biggest reasons, and it actually goes even beyond a global average, is talking about you know, understanding that whether they are at risk from COVID-19. Yeah. The other two, basically, the side effects is of course the highest component. Yeah. So as doctors, you would need to be able to communicate and also understand each and every of these vaccines that's coming out, understanding their so-called portfolio in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, and to be able to not have a cookie cutter approach to talking to your patients about it. Yeah? If they are on a Pfizer vaccine, then you would need to understand what are the potential side effects, for example, and what kind of things to look out for, as opposed to if they were on an inactivated vaccine or a viral vector, then it would be different. Yeah, and it's very important to allay that, because you know, word of mouth and all that is always a nasty thing. So what's next for COVID-19 vaccines? So again, globally, in Europe, this is actually a study that was published last month in the Lancet. Yeah. Basically, there is still a general, you know, some negative attitude towards vaccine as a whole. Yeah. The good news is that if getting data like this, yeah, where we have countries that are speeding up the vaccination dosing. Israel is one of the main key ones in the world that have actually got a high rate. Then you can see the rest as well there. Yeah. In terms of whether or not people would take the COVID-19 vaccine, again, it's on the uptrend. Yeah, that was October 2020. In terms of a study conducted and this was actually published in January as well. Vaccine confidence is actually going up as well. Yeah, between what was seen in November to January, because of the positive news that's coming out, more people are actually more positive to take a vaccine. Yeah. And then finally, in terms of vaccinations, thankfully Malaysia has started. Yeah. Currently, two out of the 5 vaccines that Malaysians are likely to be vaccinated on have already obtained the NPRA clearance. Yeah. The remainder 3 are still waiting, so they should be anytime soon in the next few months, next few weeks, next few months. Yeah. And then finally, I'd like to end with this. Yeah. In terms of global issues, there's you know, we are very lucky in the sense that we have managed to actually secure our vaccines. Many other countries are not, and some of them they thought they got their doses, but finally there's a lot of fighting pertaining to which particular doses are getting. Personally, I'm actually involved in discussing with various governments around Southeast Asia for one of these viral vector vaccines, yeah, that's coming out from TPM under Solution Group. And in discussing with them, the first question I get from them is how much can they allocate, and how much can we allocate in terms of vaccines, and which month of the year would we be able to start giving them vaccines? Yeah, so it's a very, very hot topic. Yeah, because everybody wants to get their doses first. In addition to that, we've also spoke about the COVID-19 variants impact. Thankfully, with the new platforms like the mRNA as well as the viral vector vaccines, these particular platforms are quite good in terms of being able to, for the turnaround time, to be able to do this new variants. Yeah, and it's likely that those that are vaccinated this year are likely to get some form of booster by next year that would contain such variant. Yeah, or protection against these variants. Another topic which Malaysian doctors should be really acutely aware of, and this has not really been discussed much here, is talking about counterfeit vaccines, in the region, because I'm talking to quite a number of distributors, and what's interesting is that quite a few of them have actually been approached by various parties for with various sources of different vaccines and all that, the Interpol has already alerted, has a global alert on this matter. In fact, this is an article published on their site on the 3rd of March, where they have actually dismantled a fake COVID vaccine distribution network in France. So so it's a major issue. So if you were to get vaccines or being offered vaccines, please make sure that you actually get it directly, from the importer, the distributor, the official distributors, and not just anybody. And then in terms of developments on vaccine technologies, as mentioned earlier, there's a lot of items we still don't know about the vaccines. And this is an article just published by the Guardian end of last month, where they actually, this is anecdotal, of course. It would be good to see the actual study pertaining to this. And hang on, this is actually a study that was published where basically it has been seen to be less effective in people with obesity. So there's basically saying that the healthcare workers with obesity found to produce only half the antibodies that healthy people actually do. And unfortunately, this is actually really relevant in Malaysia. Arguably, we have roughly about 16% of our population who are actually clinically obese, according to the latest stats. And basically, the question now is this due to basically when a person is vaccinated, is it going into an adipose tissue as opposed to into the muscle, or has it got to do with the pharmacokinetics due to the liposome that actually coats the mRNA that's used, and does that actually disrupt the mRNA going into the cells? Again, a lot of things we don't know at this point of time, so it's good to keep our eyes open, to and report accordingly. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. J. That was a very interesting perspective, and I think you gave us quite a lot of information that we're not really going to just ask you to hold on a little bit as well. A couple of questions I think that we need to swing your way. So, and in the meantime, I'm just going to, just before I kind of go on to the fourth panelist for tonight, I just want to inform you all, ladies and gentlemen, that the QR code is up. So you can actually scan your QR code for your CPD points. And so that's up on your screen as well. Next, I would like to invite the fourth panelist, and that is really none other than Dr. Tirunawal Kalasuraju, or Dr. Arasu, our Secretary of the Malaysian Medical Association, and he's going to give us a few quick points on practical aspects of the COVID-19 vaccination program. Dr. Arasu, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Murali. Don't worry, mine will be very fast. Less than 5 minutes. Okay, basically, as we know that we all are very, very anxious in regards to the vaccination for the doctors in the private sector. Okay, so just want to brief you all. Actually, the first meeting that the Malaysian Medical Association we had with the ministry was under the unit vaccine on the 9th of December. So since the 9th of December, the ministry actually asked us to collate data from the private sector, especially GPs and also private specialist clinics. And then the hospital side, it was taken care by APHN. Okay, so initially we have been submitting data starting from 31st December up to, in fact, up to 16 February on a weekly basis to unit vaccine. And then last week, we came to know that that the vaccination program itself is decentralized, which means the state will conduct the vaccination program. That is where there was lots of confusion, of which MMA has already highlighted to the ministry, because we are in close communication with the Ministry of Health. In fact, we already had 2 meetings with the minister in the last 1 week. Last week 1 meeting, and also we had 1 meeting yesterday with KSU, Deputy DG, the Director of CDC, and all the other relevant units and departments. So they're fully aware. And on our part, one thing we must realize is that this is a pandemic. We can't expect a perfect system. There will be a lot of glitches on the ground. And as we know that our colleagues in the public sector are also overwhelmed and in contact tracing, treating the patients, and so on and so forth. And so suddenly they're also involved in the vaccination. Of course, this will also overwhelm the system itself. So this may also cause delays. And the other thing we must understand also, even though there's a controversial issue whereby the doctors in the private sector, especially GPs, were under the category 2, but the minister has already clarified and reassured that even though we are in category 2, we are still under priority list under the healthcare workers as frontliners, and the vaccines will be given concurrently. In fact, the GPs has also started receiving appointments in the various states. Yeah, so some already got the vaccination, some already getting the names, and we need to be very patient because we must understand, like what all the speakers said earlier, there is also a global shortage of supply, and Malaysia is a small country, but we are lucky that the government has already procured certain numbers, and then probably this will go on for a couple of months before they can, in fact, complete everybody because of this program. Okay, basically the last one is that just would like to highlight that the MMA at the state level, they actually in close communication with the respective JKN, and so far most of the states, they have already had engagement with the MMA state level, and also except for Terengganu, I believe they're still trying to get in touch with them, but otherwise there will be webinars to explain, and we know that data collection, collating the data at the ground level also not synchronized. We have highlighted. So any issues, you all can always write to secretary at mma.org.my, or I think we also have the WhatsApp number. So that is all in terms of updates on what is going on the vaccination program, especially for the doctors in the private sector. Thank you, Dr. Murali.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arsul. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get on to questions. Now, just to remind you that there is a Q&A kind of box at your lower right hand of the screen, and feel free to kind of put in your questions if you need them answered. And we'll get the rest of the panelists on board now. And I've got the first set of questions, and Dr. Lim, could I direct them to you, Doctor? So this is on, shall we get Dr. Lim on? And this is really on what cells do the Pfizer mRNA vaccine and the AstraZeneca vector vaccine enter? And there's a kind of subset to that question, Doctor. When these, when it goes into the cells, how long do they stay within the nucleus of the cell?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Doctor.
All vaccines now are administered via the intramuscular route. So they all enter the muscle cells. And the muscle cells, as well as the APCs in there, and they got pick it up, and that's how it's done. Well, does it matter really what cells that the vaccine enter into, so long they got in somewhere? Well, anyway, that's how the current vaccines are designed. They're all designed for intramuscular administration. So, as to how long the vaccine, or depending on the vaccine, you're probably referring to the viral vector. How long does it stay? Well, the vector actually transfer. The vector actually transfer and insert the DNA into the host genome. I would assume that it stays there forever until, of course, the cells die. So long that the cell stays alive long enough to express that DNA and thereby express the spike protein antigen that we want the cells to express, which thereby promote the immune response and that suffices. Does
Right.
that answer the question?
Yes, I think adequately, Doctor. Thank you very much. There's also another question that I think it would be good for you to kind of field. This is on, is it good to have 2 courses of the injection to increase immunity?
That's it. That's an interesting question. I mean, all vaccines now, the manufacturer recommendation is to do it in 2 doses, a prime dose followed by a booster dose, except for, of course, for the CanSino and for the for the J&J vaccine. And they claim that they're able to induce a sufficient response just from a single dose. For people who are tempted to just do 1 dose and then not go on to do a second dose, well, some categories of people can probably get away with that. People who had previously been infected by COVID-19, you probably don't need a second dose. I think 1 dose of the vaccine is sufficient to give you the boost because you already had a natural infection. The younger people probably can get away with 1 dose if you want to. I mean, now that the AstraZeneca and Pfizer are claiming that you can do a single dose, they can do a single dose with the vaccine. I would say that it's probably not a good idea for more elderly people to just do a single dose. In fact, doing a single dose and therefore inducing a response, you have immune response that's neither strong nor weak. I mean, if it's weak, you have an inadequate response, and therefore you're a non-responder. But if you achieve some intermediate response, and then in the event they became infected, that's actually a bad situation to be in, because you have immune response that's not sufficient to overcome the virus, and the virus continues to replicate in an environment where they're under pressure from that semi-adequate immune response. That's the kind of environment that you're going to see a lot of resistant virus. I mean, the variant that emerged that become resistant to the vaccine. In fact, it's peculiar. It's often this kind of particular environment that induces new variants that become resistant to the vaccine. So by and large, that's strictly my personal opinion. I'm not really very much in favor of single dose vaccine. I know some countries are trying to do that by delaying the second dose so that more people can be vaccinated, because we do have a worldwide shortage of vaccine. But that's just my personal opinion. Perhaps Dr. Sim, you have your opinion on that.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. There's just one other question, and then we're going to switch to Dr. Sim for a while because he's got a set of questions. Doctor, how long will the immunity towards COVID last after taking any of these vaccines listed? Will we require yearly vaccinations like influenza?
Well, as for the duration of immunity and whether immunity wanes over time after vaccination, we actually don't have a good answer to that question yet, right? We know now that it protects the individual. We know now, by and large, that it does induce sterilizing immunity, and therefore could potentially achieve herd immunity. We don't know yet how long the vaccine will last, the effect of the vaccine will last. And now with emerging variants, I think, I wouldn't say it's for certain, but I think that the likelihood that we will require annual booster like the way that currently we do get annual flu vaccine, I think the likelihood of that happening is quite high actually. So regardless of whether because of waning immunity or otherwise emergence of resistant variant, I think we may well be set for the long haul here in terms of getting COVID-19 vaccine on a recurring basis. That's my prediction anyway.
Right, Doctor. So the jury is still out on that one. And I suppose we'll see it as it comes along. Thank you very much, Doctor. Dr. Sim, do I have you online as well, Doctor? There's a couple of questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So actually, there's quite a few questions, Doctor, hovering around a very similar kind of topic, which is if individuals are older than 80 years old, and then there's a set of questions for people who are older than 70 years old, and there's even one for above 60 years old. If they've got comorbidities, they've not got comorbidities, should they be vaccinated?
Right. So the concerns with vaccination are usually 2. Firstly is, will the vaccine be effective for that person? And secondly is that person at higher risk of side effects from the vaccine. And the third concern that it has to be balanced again against is what I mentioned in my last slide, is the person at high risk of getting COVID or the person at high risk of getting severe COVID. So all those groups that you mentioned earlier, I think it's very clear cut that they are all at very high risk of getting severe COVID should they contract COVID. Down in the hospitals now, we see outbreaks in old folks' homes, in geriatric units, and it's really a huge concern because the mortality rates are high, all among hemodialysis centers and all that, and there's a lot of morbidity and mortality involved. So all those subgroups of individuals you mentioned are definitely at highest risk of getting severe COVID. So it is very much advocated. In terms of efficacy, at least from the Pfizer vaccine, where we have seen very detailed reports, there's no or minimal difference as far as age is concerned. There's maybe some reports of the elderly being slightly less efficacious, the vaccine, but they think that the difference is actually very small. And then the third thing is side effects. At the moment, it doesn't appear that elderly people get more side effects than young people. In fact, the reverse is true. For many of the systemic side effects from the second dose, it appears that younger people actually get a more severe side effect from the vaccines. However, I think we are all cognizant of those reports that came out from aged homes in Europe, and from the preliminary reports, we haven't seen detailed reports coming up, but from the preliminary reports, we were told that some of them, the deaths were they don't think it was related to the vaccines at all, because they were very frail individuals who it wasn't surprising they had a baseline death rate as well. So for some of them, it was not thought to be related to the vaccines. For others, they felt that it could be that some of those individuals were actually very frail and ill at that point. So if they have like things like AGE at that point, or if they were unwell for some other reason and you give them the vaccine, they are less able to cope with the side effects of the vaccine compared to a young person. So that's why that advisory in Malaysia is that if a person has got an acute illness, do not give them the vaccine at that point, because they may not be able to tolerate the side effects of the vaccine on top of their acute illness. So wait until they are well again. So in short, the answer is they should be vaccinated. There is no contraindication to those who are elderly, and the vaccine is thought to be efficacious in them. And the only thing that we will watch out for is that if they are having an acute intercurrent illness at that point.
Thank you, Doctor. I think that's quite clear from what you're sharing. Doctor, there's another pocket of questions, and I'll just kind of group them for you. The first is a outlier. It is, I am allergic to ATT. Should I kind of, is it safe for me to get my COVID vaccine? But other than this, there's quite a few questions on what allergies are a contraindication for a person to receive the vaccine. And there's even one question of, if you have a history of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, should they actually attempt to be given the vaccine? Thank you, Doctor.
So when it comes to anaphylaxis, we are looking at 2 points. So going back in the patient's history, did the patient have an anaphylaxis in the past? So anaphylaxis will be defined as having bronchospasms or shortness of breath, and having hypotension, or or needing an adrenaline injection within the first couple of hours after an insult. So those would constitute a typical anaphylactic reaction. So there are people who have got a very typical anaphylactic reaction. So for those, we are saying no, don't go for at least not the Pfizer vaccine at the moment. We think that the AstraZeneca vaccine may be a bit safer, and maybe the Sinovac will be even safer for them. All right, but at the moment we are telling them no. There are a lot of other cases where the allergy response was clearly not an anaphylactic reaction. Yeah, they had maybe some skin urticaria, some papular rash, or some eczema-like lesions. So those ones, they are not contraindicated to getting the vaccine. So those are not anaphylactic reactions. There is a small group of individuals where we are uncertain to whether they actually had an anaphylactic reaction or not. That's because maybe after they were given a medication, or after they had a bee sting, they were rushed to a hospital or to a clinic, and they received adrenaline injection straight away. So it was too early for us to know. Maybe they had some oral mucosal swelling or facial swelling. So it may be too early to know. So for those individuals, I would look at whether they are frontliners or not. So if they are frontliners, they are going to be exposed to COVID, or they are at high risk of severe illness if they are if they were to get COVID. So I would deliver the vaccine to them in a controlled environment. A controlled environment would mean in hospital with the emergency team on standby, because we all know that anaphylactic reactions are reversible, they are treatable, and with no long-term side effects if recognized early and treated adequately. Yeah, but if they were of the general public and they are not at particular high risk of getting the side effect, I would err on not giving them the vaccine yet. So that is for anaphylactic reactions. The other thing to take note also for anaphylactic reactions is that so I wasn't aware of this until recently when I read up. The vaccine itself in that solution actually contains many chemicals. It is not just the active ingredient itself. You've got preservatives in there. You've got things to stabilize the ingredients in the vaccine. So it's there's a whole list of ingredients. But they think that the one ingredient that most likely, or they think is the cause of anaphylaxis, is what we call as PEG, or polyethylene glycol. And polyethylene glycol, PEG, is found in some other injections. So if there's a concern that somebody had a reaction to polyethylene glycol, we are discussing with dermatologists and allergists whether we can come up with a test for them, like a skin prick test, to see whether they actually have an anaphylactic reaction to whether they are prone to getting an anaphylactic reaction to PEG or not. But to be safe, if they were not frontliners, I will defer their vaccination. Sorry, there was one more question about Stephen Johnson's. There has not been any reports of severe drug reactions apart from anaphylaxis, severe dermatological reactions apart from anaphylaxis towards this vaccine. So in Singapore, they have said that Stephen Johnson's and toxic epidermal necrolysis or DRESS syndrome is a contraindication to the vaccine. But in most other countries, Singapore, they are hardly seeing any COVID now. In most other countries, it is not a contraindication. And in Malaysia, it doesn't appear as a contraindication as well, because from the studies, it doesn't look like people are more likely to get DRESS or PEN or SJS after the vaccine.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to switch over to Mr. J for a while and then come back to you. You are apparently the hottest seat tonight. Tons of questions. Ladies and gentlemen, some of the questions are actually concerning issues pertaining to who are at-risk populations who should receive or should not receive the vaccine. And I'm sure Dr. Ben will be happy to answer some of those questions. But just to share, there has been a directive out from Ministry of Health, and I think we've dropped that onto the chat as well, yeah, for you all to download and read if you need some more clarification, and that might help with some of the questions that are popping up. Mr. J, thank you, sir. There's actually two sets of questions hovering around the same topic. One is, if we get vaccination, when we do complete, is there going to be a vaccine passport, and when will we be able to travel again? That's the first question. The second question is slightly different. It is about, if I am a clinical trial candidate and I've received the placebo or the experimental option, I wouldn't know, and how long will it take for me to actually be allowed to be cleared for travel?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for those questions. The topic of immunity passport, I think, has captured the imagination globally. Yeah, and if I've been actually observing some of the things that have been done in the UK, for example. Yeah, and what people get, especially the healthcare workers, is literally just a vaccine card. Yeah. So the question now is, how do you translate that kind of vaccine cards? And in Malaysia, of course, we have the MySejahtera and all those kind of things. And there are numerous people developing apps, companies developing apps, government developing apps. Ultimately, it all boils down to who's going to accept those particular so-called immunity passports, if you may. Yeah. The other complication is this. Yeah. Each and every country are actually having different vaccines which are actually approved. Yeah. And the question now is that if somebody who takes a particular vaccine that's not approved in that other country, are they actually going to be able to get in? So these are all emerging stories. I think as more people get vaccinated and as borders open, we'll see things appearing there. Yeah. In terms of IATA, for example, yeah, the International Airline Travel Association, yeah, they've actually come out with some so-called standardized app that people would need to kind of load their information on the vaccine that they've actually taken. I think generally some people are approaching it on a basis that if they were vaccinated, then by all means, although there may be some restrictions, yeah, in terms of if it's not a vaccine that was cleared in that particular country, do they actually still need to undergo some form of quarantine or some form of testing prior to? All these kind of items have no real answer to them at this point of time. There's a lot of debate going on. There's a lot of discussion as well. And I think we'll probably see more things on this in the next 6 months. Yeah, more information on this. But certainly in Malaysia, for example, with the MySejahtera, basically recording the information on people's vaccinations, in terms of the actual data that finally comes out and how that basically translates into at least a database of who's been vaccinated is another story. The other component that some groups are also looking at, and some actually pushing for, is testing after vaccination. Basically, looking at whether people actually produce antibodies to neutralizing antibodies to COVID-19. Yeah, and I personally have actually seen quite a few companies that are in the midst of getting clearance for antibody tests that are specific for either the spike protein or the receptor binding sites, yeah, for example. Yeah, so there's a lot of people who are actually looking at this, because the thought process is that if you are vaccinated, wouldn't you want to know whether you have neutralizing antibodies, especially if you have to travel? Yeah, so that's again some other story that's coming up. Pertaining to the second question of a clinical trial candidate, if you actually know or not know that you have a placebo, and maybe this one I will probably push this question over to Dr. Lim. Yeah. But if you know that you don't actually you actually got a placebo, for example, you know, after that certain time frame that you are not supposed to do anything, you know, you've got all your so-called blood tests completed and all those kind of items. You know, basically the question now is, are you allowed from are you allowed to get vaccinated in the first place? Yeah, with another vaccine, when you are not knowing whether you have you've had the placebo or the vaccine, because bear in mind, it's typically randomized, it's blinded. Yeah, so until it's unblinded, you wouldn't know which particular group that you actually belong to. Yeah. Dr. Lim, would you like to add on to that?
Hi, Jay. Yeah, sure. In the clinical trial, we have to allow people to drop off from a trial, especially when you're offered a vaccine. Then obviously you have every right to drop from a trial to receive the vaccine. In that event, what will happen is that number one, we will unblind you, and when we unblind you, then if you were to be on the placebo, then we say, well, you could go ahead and receive the vaccine. On the other hand, actually, we will offer you to take the vaccine arm of the trial. So in some sense, we stay in the trial. On the other hand, if you were on the vaccine, then it becomes more touchy because you already been taken the vaccine. I'll be obviously still a vaccine under trial. Should you then go on to take another vaccine? Vaccine combination is becoming an interesting question now, actually, if you think about it, because there's already talk now about doing mRNA vaccine followed by, say, a protein subunit vaccine. There are certain combinations that actually may be potentially rational. But for any particular trial, of at least for those trials now in Malaysia, they're all inactivated virus vaccine. Then, well, if you ask me, if you're given an inactivated virus vaccine and then they're now offered a second vaccine, which is a Pfizer vaccine, I don't see mechanistically speaking, I don't see why not in some sense. But remember, you already have 2 doses of the inactivated virus vaccine, the trial vaccine. Then should you really go on to take a third dose of Pfizer vaccine that you're now offered? Probably not, yeah. So I would advise against it. You don't really need another vaccine. But then, of course, as a trial participant, you will have to address it yourself, having been given all the information you need. Is that your question, Jay?
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For you, doctor. And the first actually is very related to what you were speaking about just now. Is there somebody's asking about what is the difference between absolute efficacy versus relative efficacy? As some are saying that 95% efficacy, like for the Pfizer vaccine, is relative rather than absolute.
Is that directed to me?
No, I was directing it to Dr. Lim.
Okay, great.
I think it's a bit late at night to talk about statistics now. Well, the convention is to report on relative efficacy, right? Which is basically if A is placebo, B is the vaccine, then B minus A divided by A gives you the percentage reduction in infection rate as a primary endpoint, and therefore that measure the efficacy. An absolute measure will be, of course, the infection rate in the treatment arm, vaccine arm, minus the infection rate in the placebo arm. It's just that it is a convention to report on relative efficacy. Well, I think the data is probably there for you to do your own calculation on the absolute efficacy, absolute difference in infection rate. And of course, if you have absolute difference, you take the reciprocal of that, you get an NTT, number of people who must be vaccinated to protect one against COVID-19. And then you can do all these other calculations. But anyway, what does it matter? I mean, 95% is 95%. I mean, that's impressive, regardless, right? No.
Sorry if I may add on.
Sorry, go ahead, Doctor.
Because I've been in the position where I've had to answer a lot of questions on this, and one of the things I found very useful is actually
sorry, Doctor, could I get you to speak a little louder, please?
Sure.
Sorry, Doctor.
One of the things that I found very useful is actually it needed me to memorize a few numbers, which I'm not very good at. But having done that, I found that people tended to understand it better and accepted it better. So I actually quote people the numbers. For example, in the Pfizer trial, there were 18,000 people on one arm who received the real thing, and 18,000 received salt water, and they followed them up over 2-3 months, and until 170 people, and they were all blinded to whatever they received, of course, and 170 people got COVID, and when they unblinded it, then they found that out of the 170, I think 162 of them belonged in the arm that received salt water, and 8 of them belonged in the arm that received the vaccine. And when I explained it to them that way, then I think I found that many lay people understood why that was very important. That we were actually, saying that your chances of, if eventually people were to get COVID, your chances of being one of them who get COVID is much lower if you happen to be one of those who received the vaccine.
To explain to your patients as well. Dr. Benedict, Dr. Ben, sorry, if I can still have you on. I've got just one more question to ask you, and then one more to Dr. Lim. Dr. Ben, sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Doctor, so there are a couple of questions coming up on what is the maximum interval allowable between the 2 doses? Do we have to repeat the primary dose if the maximum dose has been achieved? Sorry, if the maximum interval has been passed.
I think for at least the Pfizer one, in the US they are saying the interval is 3 to 6 weeks. UK are saying that you can delay it as long as 12 weeks. I think they were looking at different strategies also in order to ensure that more people can benefit from the vaccine. But as Dr. Lim pointed out earlier, that there is a concern, at least a theoretical concern, if not a real concern, that if you space out the interval too much, then the person's antibody levels will fall below a critical level, and there's a risk of him getting infected with COVID and having subclinical levels of antibodies. And in that environment, there's a theoretical risk that a variant of the virus may actually survive and go on to propagate. So So I think that one is as far as possible. I think at the moment in Malaysia, there's no plans at all to cut it down to 1 dose for the double dose vaccine, and there are no plans to lengthen the period of the inter-vaccine duration. I've not heard of any solid plans to do so yet. Yeah. Sorry, I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much. Dr. Lim, one final one, and I think this is quite an important one to take as well, because a lot of vaccine myths around this. Is there a mechanism where the mRNA can actually transform, basically change the DNA of the host in which it is being injected into, Doctor? Any comments on this?
Well, actually, the correct question to ask is concerning the vector vaccine, but let me explain the mRNA first. mRNA is easy because mRNA through the lipo nanoparticle get transferred into the cytoplasm. It stays only in the cytoplasm. It gets nowhere near your genome, and it uses the cell's machinery. And mRNA being messenger RNA, it uses the cell machinery to then translate into protein, and those proteins are then expressed. The spike protein are then expressed to induce or to provoke an immune response. So over time, the mRNA disappears, right? So it doesn't really stays in your body. The one that really stays in your body actually is the vector, because the vector actually insert a copy of the DNA. The DNA is responsible for producing for making the spike protein into your genome, and in that manner is integrated into the genome. Then the question arises. The technical term for it is called insertional mutagenesis, which means that if you insert the DNA in somewhere in the wrong place in your genome, there's a potential that you could cause that cells to become tumorous. And that unfortunately happened recently. Yeah? So there was a trial on sickle cell disease in the US, and this company called Bluebird, I think, they have a viral vector to transfer a normal copy of the sickle cell gene into the patient with sickle cell disease, and therefore, gene therapy, right? Correct the genetic defect in those patients. And I think 5 years later, some of these patients ended up with MDS, myelodysplastic syndrome. And the investigation is still ongoing. There is suspicion that this may be an insertional mutagenesis event. So in that sense, yes, we don't know yet whether. Remember, we're not talking about doing a gene therapy on a few thousand people with sickle cell disease here. We're talking about millions of people being injected with a viral vector. But then on the other hand, all the smart people in USFDA, I'm sure they go over the data, they go over the science in much better than me, and they're prepared to approve it. And do bear in mind, of course, there are already 2 other viral vector vaccines. Both are Ebola, and both are also very, very new vaccines. So the short answer is that really we don't know. What is the longer term downstream effect of having adenovirus transfer and integrate a spike protein DNA into our genome? I don't think we know that for sure yet.
Sure. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Sim, I've got one last question for you, and then I think we're going to wrap up for the night. Doctor, this is on whether COVID patients who have recovered from COVID, when should be an ideal time interval before they actually are suitable to receive vaccines?
So in Malaysia, we are saying wait for 3 months after you have had your acute infection. It's not. That's not because we think that there's going to be side effects from the vaccine, and not because the vaccine is not going to be effective. It is going to be effective, and I think Dr. Lim mentioned it earlier. In fact, if you have had COVID before, there have been studies that show, and you get the vaccine later on. At the moment, I haven't got COVID yet, and I will get 2 doses of my vaccine. But if I compare it with another person who has gotten COVID before, even 1 dose of the vaccine, he's got antibody levels that are 10 times that of mine. So it's actually a very efficacious thing to do. The only reason I think why they are spacing it out is because the immunity from natural COVID is thought to last for at least 3 months, and there are many papers that borne this out, showing that 3 months after getting COVID, the likelihood of being reinfected by COVID is actually exceedingly rare. Yeah, so if you wait at least 3 months, at least other people can be prioritized to get the vaccine first. So it's more of a priority distribution thing. Yeah? I think in places like the US where they think they've got enough of that vaccine, they just immunize everybody regardless of whether you've got COVID or not. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Doctor. And of course, giving the last question to the most interesting person, Dr. Arasu, do we have a choice of what vaccine we receive?
Not at the moment. Sure. Oh, for sure.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Arasu, you wanted to make an announcement? Okay. You can see we've dropped into the chat box where the briefings for each state are. Please look through the chat and you can actually look for the dates. And we also put up the QR code once again.
Dear colleagues, I'm very sure that many of you are having problems to scan the QR code. The reason being, The system hangs a bit because currently the MMA app is undergoing major revamp. Because there's a major revamp, when there's a surge of people going to scan it at the same time, that is why it's hanging for a while. It hangs, but not to worry, because anyway we will manually upload at the HQ because we have your IC number and your MMC number. So rest assured your point will be awarded. And anyway, we have another 2 or 3 months that we have to achieve that the 20 points. So I think 50% of doctors are yet to achieve the target.
Okay, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think thank you very much for joining us. It's taken a little longer than expected. And then, so we'd like to thank very much the speakers, Dr. Lim, Dr. Benedict Sim, Mr. Jay Padasian, and of course, Dr. Arsu. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We also want to let you know that MMA will be putting up weekly these set of series on COVID-19 vaccines in order to kind of field your questions so that you are better able to advocate to your patients as well. Let's all work together and get everyone vaccinated, get back on track. Thank you very much. And with that, good night.
Thank you.